special guests with us today, Paula Burns and Gary Benson with InsuranceOne. Paula, ladies first, would you like to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank y'all for taking your time today. I'm with InsuranceOne. I have been with InsuranceOne since 2010, but in the industry, coming up on my 40th anniversary. I'm embarrassed to say that. I started when I was 2, right? And but it's been a blessing to work. We specialize in ministries, nonprofits, and churches. That's, I would say, 90% of what we do in our agency, and it's just a blessing to walk alongside, and I'm so glad to be here with you today.
Awesome. And Gary, a little bit about yourself, sir.
Very similar to Paula. We also nearing our 40th anniversary in this crazy world we call insurance. Almost all of that dealing with churches, nonprofits, schools. So very, very blessed, very fortunate to work with a great group of people. God's blessed us in doing that.
Love it. And Paula has actually known the founder of our company, Tim Cole, for quite a while now. I know you all were friends at conferences, and that's how, Gary, we got to know each other. So really awesome that we're able to be here together and kind of do, really speak on a topic that I think a lot of churches are going to benefit from greatly today. And it's been a very hot topic recently. But Gary and Paula, I'll pass it over to you in a moment. I'd love to talk about just some general security practices that a church can take to help their insurance or protecting their facility and the people that actually come into the building. And I know you guys had some pieces you wanted to share, so the floor is yours.
Well, why don't we begin on, let's first start talking about just some general security practices from the facility perspective and securing the premises. What are you doing in your ministry regarding, do you have security cameras? Those can be a huge benefit. I don't know if you've got them showing the exterior, interior, classrooms. Gary, we were talking the other day about preparing for this, and how important it is to have those eyes inside the facility, especially as it relates to accidents, to children. It's just another witness. Do you want to comment on that, Gary?
Yeah, Paula, we've had several situations where churches had cameras actually in the classrooms, and we've had a few accusations or maybe some questionable things that happened. We were able to pull that camera feed and look back and either ascertain really what actually did happen, or maybe there was not quite, as it was described. And that was very helpful. Actually kept us out of possible some even litigation. So that was great.
Yeah, that's happened to some of my clients as well. On playground, I remember one in particular where a child was injured, and the church was able to pull the feed and show that the caregiver did their job. It was just an accident, and accidents happen. And so security cameras, I would say, if you haven't invested in those, that's a huge benefit to you. How are you securing your egress and degress of the premises? One of the things I do when I go out to a ministry, I walk the premises, and sometimes I'll try exterior doors just to, the client obviously knows we're doing that, but if I'm doing a walkthrough with them, I want to understand if someone is trying to get in, where are those weak spots? And especially when it comes to accessing areas where we've got children, we want to make sure those are secured and someone can't get in that hasn't been screened properly. So the facilities have a huge, you wouldn't think it, but it's a huge, there are even architects that the way they design rooms to be able to have line of sight into another room is just brilliant. They're coming up with those type of features in their design for churches that help in that. So I think that's a huge step that we don't want to overlook. Gary had definitely mentioned too, if we're talking about the premises, things that you need to have on site. I think, Gary, at your church recently, you were asking about the first aid kit. I mean, something as simple as, where's the first aid kit?
Yeah, we've had we've had some situations. We always go into a church and we'll ask them, "Show me your first aid kit," and then sometimes we have to dig it out of the closet. Sometimes we have to ask 14 different people, where's where's this thing at? So it isn't very important to know where your first aid kit is. Make sure that your ushers, your those people who might be first, to learn of something, know where that is. A lot of times it could be a minor thing, but it may be something simple if somebody needs a Band-Aid. But we just need to know where that first aid kit is and look at it, have an effective one. There's a lot of different ones out there. Some of them a little bit more on you might call it the commercial grade, and that's probably what you want. You might even have to have two, depending on the size of your facility. One in the children's area, then maybe one kind of more out in the common area where it can be accessed. You want it open necessarily, but you just certainly want to be able to find it.
That's exactly right. And we also talked about, safety. We're talking safety of the premises as well, but defibrillators, have those readily available, making sure that they're in good working condition, and you've got people trained, kind of, proactive. I think the big thing, the big point is, how can we have a proactive culture rather than reactive regarding safety and security, and in every area that we look at? And that really, you have to just step back and say, what are the things that we need to implement to make it, safer, more secure? And we want to have those conversations ahead of time rather than just everybody being in a panic when something does happen. I think that's what I see the most when we look at, after the fact, we get to go back and look at situations that have occurred. And I think that is about. Anything else regarding securing a premises that you can think of, Gary?
And I actually had two questions for you all on that topic. Regarding, and I'll kind of go back to the first question regarding the security cameras. You all have a company that you've worked with in the past that you would recommend for churches that you see that really gets the job done. And I even saw somebody in the chat message about a grant that I think was available through DHS.
Amen.
Do you know any other grants that some of the listeners here today may be interested in? So I guess like kind of a two-prong, any products you recommend and any grants or any possible ways of funding that you might recommend?
I know the church co-op has a vendor, and we can probably send a link out, Lee, to people on the webinar.
Sure.
To the vendor for cameras, and they vet all of their vendors, interview them, make sure they're financially sound, that they have good that they've been recommended. So we could send that out to everybody. And then, Gary, do you want to take the second one?
Which was?
Any grants or anything like that that you're familiar with?
Lee, I'm not familiar with any grants. I did see somebody mention one. I don't have privy to that knowledge of that, so I'm sorry, I can't help there.
No worries. I know that was a curveball, but
No,
what
okay.
I will also share a company that I've worked with in the past that's been really good. So Brevo is one of our integration partners with access control with eSpace. So the way it works is like it'll automatically lock and unlock your doors based on events going on. And they have a security camera that they recommend called Eagle Eye, and it ties in with all their stuff. We're not affiliated whatsoever. Don't hold us accountable. I did see a demo of the product though, and it was really cool. Like you could even say, you could type in there like it's like the movie. You could type in and say, I want to see everybody with a red backpack last week, and it's going to pull the data and show you all of that specifically.
Awesome.
So there was some really cool stuff there. That company's called Eagle Eye. And yeah, Cody just dropped a comment about that as well, that they can potentially use existing IP cameras. So you don't have to have the fancy bells and whistles.
Right.
So anyway, and I hear a lot of talk also in the chat about DHS. Thank you, whoever brought that up, by the way. I think that's going to help a lot of people here. So thank you for sharing that knowledge in the chat.
Awesome.
So I guess my other question I had for you on that first piece, Paula and Gary, from your seats, how often do you see churches kind of winging it with that stuff in terms of first aid and the emergency preparedness of the church? Is that a common thing to have people kind of just winging it, or how prepared would you kind of rate churches on a general sense?
Well, I think what we see is I think some of your larger churches really do a very nice job there. But I think the opposite of that is the smaller to mid-sized churches probably do not do a very good job of that.
Hmm.
I would say they have a general policy, but what we're finding a lot of times is there's a lot of disconnect between individuals. One person may kind of be on the know or be on point, and another person may not have a clue.
Yeah.
And so I think the communication we've talked about is paramount in some of these planning things, and that really goes from the parking lot guy to the usher to the pastor. I mean, in all between. That's the key of how are we going. Basically, we just had X happen. What do we do? And I really think the churches in general, as Paula mentioned, they more react to that than plan for it in advance. So, and all these things don't have to be tremendous volumes of preparation. They're just really simple discussions. Talk with your insurance agent, just have a meeting and just say, what are some basic things that we can do, in case something happens at our church?
Yeah. What do you see typically, and maybe there is no common denominator here, so forgive my ignorance, but is there any common theme that you've seen where churches are lacking in terms of their emergency preparedness?
I would say the biggest thing and the root cause is we may have an off-duty officer at a church, but we've got a group out in the parking lot that sees a man coming in a black trench coat in June in Texas. And how are they communicating to that officer? It's how do we communicate? How it can be as simple as, okay, this is the on-duty officer's cell number, or we have a radio, some way that our team members know who is on duty that day, and we can get a hold of them. We can collaborate, like I said, whether that's with a headset, a radio, a cell phone. But typically when we look back and we've had issues, they didn't even know how to get it, who were the ushers that day, right? Who were the greeting team that day? It just needs to be coordinated. And that doesn't have to be hours of preparation. Sometimes it's just, this is the cell number. And I tell you, we had a situation at a church one time where we had a child that had been not been adopted. They were in a dispute, a custody dispute. And so the parent that did not have custody had been threatening that they were going to come get the child. Well, we had to they called me and said, we're very concerned, the mother is, that they're going to try to show up this Sunday. So we had to do a coordinated effort. There was a constable that, was very, I guess, a good friend to the church, and they were on duty. So we had everybody coordinated. Everybody understood what they were supposed to do. We had additional volunteers stationed at the egress areas, and people knew what this person looked like. It's communicate. If there is a heightened threat, how is that information being disseminated to the entire team? That wasn't going to be just your constable. That's going to be the volunteers on duty that day, the teachers, the Sunday school teachers. Everybody needs to be looped in that particular situation.
That's great. So that's actually an awesome segue for kind of the next piece that I wanted to ask you all about. In terms of going a little more involved with this, would you mind sharing a little bit more about the personnel or the people involved in securing the premises and what kind of best practices are around that kind of topic of things?
Go ahead, Gary. You want to?
Well, I think first and foremost, and I know this is a challenge, but the uniformed police officer on site, by far and away, is your best option. If you can afford that, that's the number one way, because they're in uniform. they're visible. That's an automatic deterrent. We try to get them to have their patrol vehicles on site, but we understand that's a little bit difficult at times because they're typically off duty and not everybody allows them to do that. But if you could even have that setting out there, we've kind of gotten past the point. Was a time there where people had a little, pushback on that because, well, there's police at a church. What is that going to look like? Do we have problems? But I think we've gone past that era now, and it's actually now more accepted. Certainly very, very valuable, because if there should be something tragic happen, you want somebody there that's very well trained and knows how to do that. And we'll talk a bit later about how that liability can shift too. But that's the number one. If you can get there, do that. And because the opposite of that is having your own security, which was going to present a lot of challenges, which I know we're going to talk about that. And Paula, you might want to expand on that. But so if we can get there, number one, or you could do, certainly you could contract with a security company. That's expensive. Not very many churches can do that. But that's certainly another option.
I agree. Definitely our highest and best would be if we have a uniformed officer. We can either hire them, or that can be volunteer, most definitely. But it starts in the parking lot. So you've got your parking lot team, possibly your ushers, your greeters. That's all part of your team. And I like the term first responder team for our volunteers. And it starts there, and we've got to be communicating from the parking lot in, and coordinating that. We kind of, the elephant in the room is volunteers that carry, right? And we want to get into some of that. In Texas, I know there are people from all states, all over the place, that are here. In Texas, we can carry unless it's posted. Okay. And so, you've got people that are doing concealed carry, and, churches in Texas can say, if it's open carry, they can, basically have it posted where they want it concealed. And so, you don't know at the church who's carrying and who's not carrying. But we can have a volunteer team that, we may not be asking them to carry, but they're carrying for their own, protection as well. So there are a lot of caveats and a lot of different formats to this. The highest and best is that if you are asking somebody to carry, is your hired police officer or your off-duty officer. That would be the highest and best.
Paula, let's talk a little bit more about how the insurance companies are responding to each of those scenarios.
Okay. So let's first of all talk about highest and best. That's the easiest, right? I'm gonna give you the hard one, Gary.
Oh, thanks, Paula. Let me take this one.
Okay. So the highest and best is, we talked about off-duty officer, or we can, hire an officer. The insurance carriers all are in agreement with that. We just don't have a problem with that. You need to disclose it, let them know. They all respond differently. Some of them want to rate per officer, some just, some don't. But we need to disclose that. So that's on an even field across the board. Would you agree, Gary? We really don't see pushback on that.
That's a number one. Okay.
Okay. So then let's peel that down. Let's peel the onion a little further. Let's say we have a first responder team that we've got in place, and we've got a hired officer or off-duty officer on that, and they're armed. The next highest and best would be that we don't ask any of the individuals on the team to be armed. Liability comes into play if we ask them to be armed. Now, they can be armed. It's like a don't ask, don't tell, but we're not asking you to be armed. Okay. That's the second best. And we really don't get pushback on that either. Gary, would you agree that where we have our problem is when we are asking people who are not off-duty officers to be armed.
Yeah, I mean, we and the insurance carrier themselves are the ones that if the church is asking their volunteers or requiring even their volunteers to carry, that's where we're seeing major issues to the point where we've actually had some carriers that will not renew a church or certainly not entertain a quote on a church if those situations exist. They just do not want that exposure.
Right.
And some of them are, quite frankly, some are a little leery if you have volunteers that carry, period. But for the most part, as long as the church is not requiring them or asking them to carry, we're getting fairly positive reactions on that.
It is, you know, we in different carriers respond to that differently. Okay. I'm not saying it's one and done. It's not, but the exposure enters into a professional liability exposure then, because you have a armed team and you're asking them to be armed. So then it's the duty of the church to make sure the person you're asking has been qualified. And I just submit to you that if we've got a debt and one of these people shoots somebody accidentally, let's say it's the worst case, you know, I mean, if that person's coming in shooting, I mean, I hope they shoot them. We want to defend our people, right? But if they come in and, you know, accidentally hit someone and kill them, then it's going to be, okay, church ABC, what did you do? You asked this individual to be armed. What did you do to make sure they were properly trained, right? And so that due diligence comes back then onto the church. So that's how the liability, you know, enters them.
Yeah, and I see a few questions coming in the chat there. Hey guys, and what'll help us make sure we don't miss your question, if you could drop it in the Q&A section. It goes away only when we answer it, so it'll just make sure we don't lose it. But Steve asked a question. I had something similar in mind. What's the primary reason companies are averse to armed volunteers? Is it a question of training and qualification, or is it something else?
It's training. It's how do we show that they are properly trained, right? Yeah. And that carriers are it's interesting. We've got one particular carrier and they want to see all the training, okay? And see that that's done. But others, they don't even want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, okay? They're like, if you're allowing your volunteers that are not off-duty officers to be armed, you're done, you're out, okay? Wow. So it depends. I know that sounds like a attorney response, but it really depends. And the best scenario that they can put themselves in is to have the armed exposure hired out, you know, or have an off-duty officer, and the rest of the team, first responders, you know, because it's most of the time when we're responding, it's going to be some type of health issue. Maybe someone's disgruntled. It's not normally going to be we're pulling a gun, right? It's going to be very, very minor. So the first responder team is so much more than just carry.
Yeah, and James also asked, what about less than lethal weapons? Kind of in that same example there.
Well, I haven't seen them push back on like pepper spray or something like that. I haven't. That's a great question. Great question.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a consideration. The carrier is obviously going to be more acceptable on those things like that. Just there for those things, especially, you'd have to be training because, you know, anytime you start physically engaging with somebody else, and that would be a form of that. You want to be very careful. Certainly want to have the proper training on that. But, you know, touch on a couple of things, Paula, on the uniformed police officers. One of the things we haven't really talked about, you know, granted, the shootings, thank goodness, are very rare, actually. But when they do happen, should the police officer pull their weapon or discharge their weapon, when we talk about liability, that liability suddenly shifts from the church to that entity that the officer works for. And that's one, if there's another primary reason you want to consider them, that would be it. Because if your person pulls a weapon, then it's the church's liability that's exposed. And by the way, I guess while we're on that same topic, one of the things that when we talk with all of our churches and they have these teams, and listen, we get it. We understand that they want to protect their people, and none of us are going to question that. But one of the things that everybody needs to be aware of is that that individual, if there's litigation that's brought, the church's insurance will not cover them. They're going to protect the church. They will not protect the individual. So if you're an individual serving on that type of team, please have your own professional liability policy. You can get those very inexpensively. They probably range from about $200 to $400 a year. So I would highly, highly recommend. Church can't really require that, but the church can certainly encourage them or ask them, because the church needs to make sure that those individuals understand that, hey, I'm sorry, but our church policy is not going to protect you, if you shoot somebody. So you need to have your own protection. And they probably should anyway, if they are a concealed carry kind of person.
And Gary's referring to the gun liability. So,
Yeah.
if they were to shoot someone, they can be on the team and be rendering aid and things like that. But he's talking about if they were to pull out a weapon and shoot somebody. That's what he's referring to. You can get I think NRA has a little individual handgun policy, but Gary, you had a couple sources as well. We're happy to send those out.
Yeah. US Law Shield and USCCA are two probably the better known ones.
Yeah, US Law Shield is wonderful.
Yeah. And USCCA has a little bit more robust policy, but it's also a little bit more expensive.
Yeah. Similar question on that topic. Cody asked, what is the liability of the church for off-duty officers versus third-party security officers versus trained volunteers versus untrained volunteers?
Great. Take that, Paula.
Okay, so the first part of that was, what is the liability of the church for? So read that again, Lee.
Yeah, for off-duty officers versus third-party security officers.
Okay. If it's a third-party security officer, all of that is completely, they're naming you as an additional insured. Okay, so if you contract with a third-party company, that security company is naming the church as an additional insured. And what that means is, anytime someone's asking you to be named as an additional insured, it simply means I will defend you. Okay, so they're transferring that whole exposure to that security company. That's why it's more expensive. But you have to realize what you're transferring and what you're getting. Okay, so the professional liability side of that and resulting litigation would fall, first of all, under their coverage. And then the church would be secondary. So they're taking a primary stance on that. So that's huge. So volunteer officer it's going to defend their own actions would fall under the licensing organization. Okay, if it's a city or county, officer, but they're not going to defend the church. Does that make sense? The church is its own organization. It happened on their site. The coverage that we have would defend the church in that case. Now, if the church is sued, okay, for negligence, the coverage trigger there would be, and let's just take this scenario, Lee, that someone comes in, it's on a Sunday morning, and it's some random person off the street, so we can sort of follow it and start shooting, okay? Let's say in this situation, I do have an officer there. And they are someone that's moonlighting, which is typically what we see. And they have to shoot, okay? Then the officer, and let's say maybe they had to shoot a couple times and missed, and someone else was injured that was innocent. The officer's own professional liability would be covered under that organization that's licensed them. In a perfect world, this is how it works. And then the church would be defended should someone sue the church. Okay, coverage is triggered by negligence in that case. Now, there are and they're new, so you may not have heard of them. Some of my larger churches, we do write these. They're called shooter policies. So what happens is, if someone sues someone is shot, these shooter policies come in like what we call a medical payments, no fault. And their injuries, you know, they can get all of their medical care up to whatever threshold you purchase. So it's very important if you feel like that's an issue that your directors or your trustees, your eldership is concerned about, that you look at that. They're not very expensive. You could have, so because otherwise the person who was shot is going to have to sue the church to get any substantial coverages, compensation for their medical injuries.
And even if they sue the church, Paula, they have to be proven negligent.
They have to be proven negligent. So they're going to benchmark you against other churches your size. Are you doing what's reasonable? Did you do your due diligence? I'd submit to you most churches are, right? This is something that is still up in the air because we just don't have supporting litigation on that, or not that I know of or I'm aware of, that to know what's going to happen. I've debated this issue with carrier executives and said, what would you do? Some of them go, oh, well, we would probably just settle, but will they, if there's $1 million ask? I don't know. I don't think so. Yeah. So it's better to, so that coverage does also, under a shooter policy, provide business income. That's not going to be triggered under your standard church policy. Okay. So let's say in this same scenario, after this shooting, we have people that just leave because they're upset about the event. And we lost membership. Maybe this happened in a school. Okay. Maybe the same thing happened in a school. You probably most definitely would have loss of business income. That's not going to be triggered under the standard coverage policy, but it would under a shooter.
Really good question. Really good answer. That was great. I had one other question here, and I think this is my mistake, Steve, so I apologize. This may be out of context. And Paula, I apologize too, because I'm going to direct the question to you. I think when we were initially talking about communications, regards to uninformed officers, you mentioned the word about disclosing that information. I think the question is who do you disclose that to? And Steve, if you remember in more context, let me know. And I apologize, I missed that.
Regarding communicating with your ushers, greeters, and your officer, is that what you're saying?
No, I think
Gary.
I know that. I think I saw the chat come in. I think he was, when you said disclose to who, you're talking about the insurance carrier themselves. But
about the officer, that if we have an officer that,
Mm-hmm.
Usually there'll be a supplemental application and they'll ask you about your church security. And if you do hire off-duty officers, you just need to notify them, let them know that that's going on, just so everything's there. We don't have a question about it.
Good. One other question that came in. Oh, well, before I move on, it looks like Steve dropped a chat. Yep. Okay. You got it. Thanks, Gary. I just wanted to make sure we got that answered. I apologize for missing it. Jared asked a question I'm curious about too. Who all should we run background checks on?
Wow. Everybody. No.
I was going to say everybody.
Well,
no, we're reasonable people.
Yeah. So background checks. Well, we could open up a whole can of worms on this one. Let me say this first of all about background checks in general. Because a lot of times, and this is totally off topic what we've been talking about, but a lot of times we're talking about running background checks on those who work with minors, right? Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a large segment of the church population believes that is their screening program.
Right.
And sadly, or maybe not sadly, but statistically speaking, less than 10% of any background check will ever get any kind of hit. So if you're just doing a background check, you're not doing really what you need to do. It's a pretty ineffective program to do a background check. There's so many ways an individual can actually have minor misdemeanors. I mean, because the way the background check process works, because it has to filter, it's a database, and it has to filter into that database. You could have something that happened a week ago, and it's not going to be there. So we have to be very, very careful on our background checks to to count them as solid screening methods. But as far as background checks on, I guess on your security team, Paula, I guess we could have different opinions on this. I don't know that that's highly up there on the list of to-dos. It's certainly not a bad idea. Background checks are cheap. I mean, you can run one for $10 or $15. So if you want to do that, that's great. It's probably a good safeguard. I don't know that it's highly recommended.
And on background checks, though, to caveat what Gary was saying, especially if they're working with youth, we do have to have them that checks a box, right? Just a due diligence box. And
we have to do them.
We have to. If you've got a first responder team that is, your volunteer safety, a first responder, they're going to respond to and they're kind of your key people. They're kind of the ones that are almost like they're on staff. They're always there. I don't think that's a bad idea. If we've got people, I always tell my churches, if you've got people they're basically like they're on staff, they're on that team all the time, they're interacting with your people, it's not a bad idea. It's always great to have Exhibit A if you go to court, because the church just has to prove we did our due diligence. So it's not a bad idea. It's a great question.
Yeah, we have, and background check companies, I mean, they're easy to find. We have one listed on our website. It's slightly discounted if anybody wants to access that. So
you guys definitely opened a can of worms with background checks. We got a lot of questions.
I told you we could have a whole session on that one.
And I can vouch, sometimes they are very inaccurate. I mean, Tim had me take one before I started working here. They didn't find anything. No, I'm just kidding. Jared asked about, what about front door greeters? I assume that would be kind of the same answer.
I've never told anybody to do a background check on a front door greeter. I mean, that's kind of where a lot of people start out. But
unless they look at you funny, right?
Yeah. If they're working with minors or money, we have it's a no, no, you've got to do that. So minors or money. And that's what I always say. Otherwise, it's just really up to your discretion and judgment. Is your team going to be around kids a lot? Are they going to be coming to events where your children are? Well, then yes, I would definitely do that then.
And Reverend Anthony, I'm going to try and answer ask your question here, but I may be misunderstanding. He said emotional distress lawsuits, additional to physical injury in a shooting, meaning bystanders. Do you all have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's one of the biggest risks is you have a bystander that's there that got injured, right? So that emotional distress and so I think a shooter policy is going to help you. It's going to cover that individual. Lawsuits are motivated either by emotional or financial. So that checks both of the boxes. If someone's injured, they're going to have a financial and emotional strain, as well as their family. So I think that would help definitely cover that gap.
Love it.
That exposure.
And this is a question I definitely had in the back of my mind hearing you all. If background checks aren't that effective, what else should churches be doing to improve effectiveness?
Are we talking about working with minors? Or are we talking about if we're so? I mean, predominantly, we're going to see background checks work, as Paula mentioned, with minors and money. I think it's a great answer there. Really, what you need, I'll try to put it succinctly, but you need a written program. Don't make it crazy. You don't want volumes of paper. You want a written program with what do we do on different things. You kind of start there and outlining those things. Again, a kind of to-do list of things we do. Who gets to work with minors? Probably one of the biggest ones that if we got every church to adopt this and adhere to it, would be what we would call the 2-adult rule, the never alone rule. Got to drill that into, especially our blessed youth pastors, and who want to go pick up kids and take them to Starbucks or whatever else. You cannot do that, because if it's just your word against somebody else's, you're going to lose. There are accusations, unfortunately, that are made. And if you don't have, Paula likes to say, who's your witness? So this event was just reported. Who is going to back your story up? And if you don't have anybody to back your story up, you're going to probably be on the losing side. So there are several things we're happy to make any kind of material available, but never a lone rule, written policy, just general safety protocols. There are some sample policies again on our website. I want to keep referring to that, but they're simple, 2 or 3 pages long, very easy to follow.
Yeah. It looks like Jonathan Parsons, and hope you're doing well, man. He mentioned something in the chat too that he recommends, so that could be looked at as well.
Okay.
One other, and after this, everybody, by the way, we will be sharing their website and where you can learn more about them. So if there were anything that they mention on their website, things like that, just keep that in the back of your head. We'll be sharing that closer to the end here. I did have a specific question, Paula and Gary, and if this gets too in the weeds, go ahead and let me know. But Robert said that we have a 200 student day school on campus. Should we be screening vendors and contractors and all workmen, example, plumbers, painters, etc., and identify them when they are on site? We're installing Raptor to check everyone who comes on site. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's a great question. And we have that a lot. And I always look at frequency and severity. So if I've got let's say I have a janitorial contractor, they're on site every day. They might be interacting. I'm certainly going to ask my janitorial company about their screening process, right? Make sure they're doing background checks and screening. And if it's a vendor that's going to come one time, we're certainly going to follow that 2 or more rule where people are watching, right? Where we know they're on campus, they have to check in. And we're not going to let them around our children without people there. But we physically can't background check every single vendor. If it's a vendor that is on site regularly and all the time, you need to ask what type of screening process are you doing, especially if they're going to be interacting with your children. Or many of the ministries I work with have those come in and clean in the evening when children are not on campus, just as another added precaution, which I would definitely recommend. But there are times when it can't be avoided, and you've got to have that covering for your children. You can't, especially like maybe there's a public restroom that they're all sharing. We can't have that happen. We would have to change our accommodations and risk manage that ahead of time. So important communication again for maybe the facilities side of the ministry to coordinate that with the school and say, look, we're going to have a vendor come on site here. In that case, that vendor can't share that restroom. We're going to have to make other accommodations, right?
That's good.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was a really good question. I gravitate towards it because I'm a huge fan of renting out space that the church isn't using at certain times. Scooter asked, what responsibility do we have if we rent out our space to outside groups? Do we need to require background checks in that kind of manner?
Gary, do you want me to start, or you want to go ahead on that?
Go ahead and I'll fill in, Paula.
Okay. Well, okay. This is sort of my soapbox.
That's why I let you talk.
So every ministry, oh my goodness, if you don't hear anything else we say today, please have a building use agreement. Everybody that comes on your site, and Lee knows, you have got to have a building use agreement. Number one, it tells them when they can come, where they have to be, what space they can use, what time. They have to abide by all laws. Your mission statement. They can't, be operating and doing things against the mission of the church. In that building use agreement, you should be capturing the data. Are you an organization? Yes or no? Okay. Are you insured? Yes or no? Automatically, and this could be a whole webinar. We've divided that into 2 groups. One group that's insured, one group that's not insured. Okay. So that's where I tell my ministers, all right, the ones that aren't insured, that's you. That's your church. Okay. Let that sink in. Those groups that are not insured, that's you. So what screening processes do you have? All has to be under that. If they are insured, there's a statement in that building use agreement that says such and such organization shall name ABC Church as an additional insured on their general liability policy, etc. One that we have also goes into, if it's children's programming, talks about sexual misconduct, that you are screening, you are, has a little more teeth, but please reach out to us. We are happy to help you with that. And, that is a critical situation. We've never seen litigation like we're seeing post the Boy Scout lawsuits. And so it's making building usage, it's just highlighted this, okay? So this was a building usage issue. So I highly recommend that you take a look at that process and know that if they're not insured, then that's you. So that's your programming.
Yep.
Go ahead, Gary. Sorry.
Oh, no, girl, you did it well. Nothing to add.
All right. Well, we have about 10 minutes left here. We've been talking quite a bit about emergency preparedness, what to expect. We went down some rabbit trails, but Paul and Gary, talk to us a little bit about just the church insurance piece in a little more depth. I'd love to hear more about like the state of the market, challenges from an insurance perspective, and all that kind of fun stuff.
Well, obviously we have people from all over the U.S. on this call, and we are predominantly based in Texas, although we do deal with a little bit outside of Texas. We have certainly seen the market tightening severely in the last year or probably two, where we have carriers, especially in some of our coastal states, which has become extremely difficult on underwriting guidelines for opening those up. And us in Texas, when the further we get down to the coast, the more difficult, or also in the some of the major metropolitan areas where we have, again, in Texas, we have hail exposures and tornadoes and things like that. So overall, though, we've certainly seen a very, very difficult market. And so we've, when we look at all these different programs that we've talked about, insurance carriers are zooming in on certain things. I mean, they're really heightened on the armed security now. They're really heightened on what churches are doing to protect their minors. And, the churches that are very proactive in those areas, quite frankly, are going to be a step up on anybody else. And so, but we are dealing with rate increases. We are dealing with deductible adjustments. And it's a trend we've seen before. We've done this long enough that we've seen this, and this too shall pass probably eventually, but I just don't know when. Right now, we're in a pretty severe cycle, probably more severe than we've seen in a while.
I would say one of the biggest things that you need to prepare for, that I highly recommend, the market, we're in sort of a perfect storm when it comes to property values. We've never before seen property values as far as replacement cost, materials, supply chain issues. We've just not been in this situation before. And we entered into 2021 with some almost biblical proportion events. We had a freeze that hit the South like we've never had impact us before. And property values were shooting up at that same time. And so insurance carriers were, we had sprinkler systems freeze where the whole buildings, all of the interiors were lost. And we've never seen, losses. I had a carrier call yesterday, and I think it was that storm Elliott. There was another, like a big freeze event that it reduced some capacity, like in half of their return on investment. They said they've never seen anything impact their ROE like that happened on the East Coast. So it's behind the scenes. Then you have the reinsurance where all the carriers, I don't want to get in the weeds, but the reinsurers are now saying, oh, we have a lot of losses here. We have to get that money back. And they're looking over the past few years and trying to recover their money. So that drives rate. Be very diligent. If you do not have an appraisal on your property, I highly recommend, because they are not wanting to insure buildings for less than the replacement cost value now. It's very, very difficult. So if it's been a long time since you've had an appraisal, I would recommend you do that process. And we've got people, I know in the Texas area that we've worked with that do some really good pricing. But that's something the church, we can do some what we call replacement cost guides as well. But that's definitely a process that, you're don't be surprised if they don't come up back wanting to raise those values.
Great. Specific question for you all. Reverend Anthony mentioned he uses USAA. Do you all work with USAA? And he also asked, would you be willing to consult with their church to help guide us at all? Or guide them at all, excuse me.
Go ahead, Gary.
We don't represent USA directly. They're not again, I'm going to speak for in Texas. They're not a market for us in Texas. They may be in some other states. But as far as consulting or working with Reverend Anthony, absolutely. Depending on what the nature of the request is, we're happy to do everything we can.
Cool. And just as a reminder, everybody, when we're wrapping up here in about 5 minutes, I will share their website and Paula and Gary's email, if that's okay with you two.
Great.
Just in
Sure.
case you all have questions after the fact.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, here we go. Now, this is probably a whole nother webinar. We'll do this again, Paula and Gary. And this is really up my alley. How does deferred maintenance affect policies?
Oh gosh. Go ahead, Lee and Gary.
Gary, this is all I want to hear from you, man, not me.
Yeah, Paula. Well, oh gosh, that's I don't even know how to answer that question really shortly. Help me
It's
out
never
there, Paula.
good.
Okay.
It's
Well,
never
Yeah.
good.
let's talk about your roof. What would you in like 2 minutes? Okay. Hurricane Harvey, and for my Houston people, we shout out to you. I saw some of you online. We've never seen rain like we ever have seen before. It is in Hurricane Harvey. Okay. But Harvey was not a wind event. It was a rain event. So if there was an old roof sitting out there that someone was just praying a huge hailstorm came across so they could get a new one, there was no wind. We didn't have hail with it. We didn't have a coverage trigger. So insurance is not a maintenance policy. It is, how did the water get in? Well, I had a church that I wrote that we knew they needed a new roof. It was 30 years old. They knew they needed it. And I said, I will write this. The carrier's agreeing to do this, but you have to replace this roof within 6 months. We did that. But we said, they said, okay, we're going to do that. Hurricane Harvey hits and I get a phone call. I'd set a storm office up in Tulsa. I was up there and I was taking these calls, and they called and I said, Pastor, tell me that you replaced that roof. Please tell me you replaced that roof. No. And I said, think of it, that first dollar is yours. If that water comes in off of a roof that is not maintained, it's just wear and tear. That's the first exclusion. Everything ensuing, the ensuing damage is not going to be covered. Okay. So we don't want to set the ministry up for something that wouldn't be covered, right? Had wind impacted it and tore it up, or hail tore it up, that's different. But Harvey was truly a test of, is our roof, maintained, right? So we can't put that deferred maintenance. I mean, this was that over $500,000 loss to this ministry. They knew it. I'd already explained this to them ahead of time, told them about the risk. I was so worried. And when he called, he goes, I know. So please don't put off making sure that things are in good repair.
Yeah, and especially on when it comes to metal roofs.
Yeah.
The metal roofs do wear out. The rivets do wear out. The flashings do wear out. And so you do have to have ongoing maintenance, even on a metal roof. And Harvey, as Paula spoke about, 90% of my calls were involving metal roofs on leaks.
Wow.
And unfortunately, 100% of those had a no answer.
Mhm.
So, and those are
And
never fun.
And I'll just on this note, because I have to bring it back to our company somehow, right?
There you go.
Every $1 maintenance deferred, according to IFMA, our studies as well, will cost you $4 down the road. Do
I
not
agree.
defer maintenance, not just from an insurance perspective, but it's going to cost you more in so many areas. And every component in your building has a life cycle. Your trees outside, your bushes, your roof, your parking lot, your paint on your walls, your furniture inside, everything has a life cycle.
Mhm.
So just a friendly reminder of that from your friends at Smart Church. But Paula, Gary, anything else that you would like to share for our guests before we close out today? And just for everybody to know, I did in the chat share their website and
Mhm.
both Paula and Gary's email. So before this webinar ends, make sure you copy and paste that somewhere because you won't have it once we end this webinar. So just make sure you save that. But Paula, Gary, any last minute thoughts, advice for you all?
The only thing I'll share is, I mean, again, we love working with churches. They're a blessing. There's a lot of different facets, and outside of insurance, our kind of mantra is not about insurance; it's about protecting your ministry. We do really mean that, and so there's any way we can help with resources, conversations, whatever. We are certainly happy to do that.
I would definitely say regarding security, that get to know your local law enforcement, your constable, people that, invite them to coffee. You don't want to be meeting and also your risk manager or your insurance advisor. These people you need to be interacting with them. Well, your team needs to know them ahead of the time of disaster. Okay. Then people are more comfortable because that partner's there on site with them to help walk them through it. Same thing with your security. The people that, if you don't have security that you're hiring, but just someone in the area, your constable that you work with or your local officers, know them ahead of time. Have them walk through your building. I would highly recommend that. Have them come do a walkthrough. That way they know the layout of your facility. All of those things come into play and are helpful during a crisis.
Yeah.
Good advice.
Well, Paula, Gary, today was awesome. Thank you guys so much for taking an hour out of your
Absolutely.
day and dropping some knowledge on everybody.
There you go.
Everybody listening, the recording will be sent to you later this afternoon or tomorrow once it's done rendering. Make sure to get that in everybody's hands. And of course, if you have any questions or you didn't get Paula or Gary's info, shoot me an email. Happy to get that to you guys. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your week.
God bless.
God bless you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.